Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. I know some of you, but not all of you. It's fun to see some of my RAs um, popping up right before we get started. Hi, guys. Yeah, so today I'll be talking about some work that this award from the Applied Psych department allowed me to present at SCRA earlier this year. It was a really great experience. So I am very grateful and glad to be able to share that work back to you all as well. It's still in progress work, so stay tuned. It will be being updated before it is, before it goes anywhere. But this is the behind the scenes as it's in progress. Let's see if it'll let me go to the next slide. Perfect. So today I'll be talking about work exploring relationships between critical consciousness and well-being among system impacted youth. So before we start with that, just some definitions to get us started. Who are system impacted youth? System impacted youth broadly are young people who have been directly affected by either the child welfare system, the juvenile legal system, immigration systems, or some combination of those systems. And they are disproportionately Black, Brown, Latine, low income, queer, demographically. At any given time in the US, about 35,000, 36,000 young people are in confinement through these systems. So they're not living at home, they're being held in some sort of residential facility. And the majority of those young people are there for offenses or what people might call crimes that don't actually involve threat of harm or actual harm to another person. So those might be things like theft or vandalism, not things that are putting a person in harm's way. And a lot of them are actually there for what are called status offenses, which are things that are only considered violations on the basis of young people being having the status of being a minor. So that's going to be things like skipping school, which is on the slide, but also things like drinking alcohol or even like running away from home. So you can basically go to a juvenile facility for running away from home. And then another definition, what is critical consciousness? Critical consciousness is a framework that we use to understand how youth and other people, adults, but mostly youth, recognize, understand structural inequity, feel motivated to make changes when they recognize structural inequity, and then actually go ahead and engage in that action. And so as we saw in the first slide, system impacted youth are experiencing a unique and particularly intense sort of nexus of structural oppression. So we might expect that research on critical consciousness, on ways that young people understand oppression and feel motivated to change oppression, we might expect that that sort of field would focus on, or at least include, system impacted youth. It doesn't really. They're incredibly underrepresented in critical consciousness research. And so that's so far a significant limitation of sort of that work. And one thing that this study among the larger research and trial that it's from is seeking to address. Wow, it doesn't want me to use my arrows, which is really a bummer. Okay. So when we think about critical consciousness, we split it out into three components. The first one is critical reflection. So that is just this recognition of injustice. So the ability to sort of recognize that injustice is structural, systemic, attributing something to that structural injustice and not to like a personal failing or a moral failing of an individual. The second component is critical motivation. So that's going to be an internal feeling of motivation, drive to make change. And another important piece of that is a sense of efficacy. So it's also important for critical motivation to feel like capacity for change is also within that person's ability. And then critical action is very much what it sounds like. It is any type of action, individual or with a group, that aims to dismantle these structural oppressions and sort of increase justice, increase equity. So in prior research, scholars have found that critical consciousness has associations with a bunch of positive outcomes, mostly kind of externalized outcomes. So like achievement-esque outcomes. So they find that young people who have higher critical consciousness do better at school. They like things like getting better grades, getting into college, feeling more like motivated to go to college, those kinds of things, less like dropping out, better attendance, similar types of like outcomes, but in the work realm. They make smarter sexual health decisions, according to scholars. And then a much smaller portion of research has started exploring, okay, we know about these external positive associates, but like, what about internally? Like, how is that critical consciousness development impacting how the youth are doing, like themselves? And basically, what they find is that it's complicated. And that's not surprising because well-being, first of all, complicated. Critical consciousness, also complicated. So the research so far seems to sort of split things out by those components that I was talking about. They find that critical motivation is the most consistently positively associated with like good mental health, positive mental health, as well as like socio-emotional health, reduced risk behaviors, and thinking that that's just because feeling motivated and efficacious in other work, in other realms, has been linked to positive mental health. So that's not hugely surprising. Critical action kind of flip-flops. Some folks find that it's a risk factor, some folks find that it's a protective factor. And there's some really awesome qualitative work with youth activists that offers like great sort of descriptive explanations of how this happens, in that these young organizers explain to the researchers how these organizing spaces are spaces of community and nurturing, and where they find a place that they feel like they can be with their people, and also spaces of organizing frequently are spaces where they are choosing to put themselves in harm's way in terms of, you know, state-based violence at protests or engaging with these systems that are marginalizing them. And then in terms of critical reflection, it is so far seems kind of dependent on what's going on with the other two domains. And that's because if we have a young person who recognizes that their world is deeply inequitable and that there's structural oppression everywhere, but doesn't feel like there's anything they can do about it, and isn't actively doing anything about it with their peers or in community with anyone who's doing anything about it, that unsurprisingly tends to not do great things for their mental health. Like, it's not hugely positive for well-being to just know that everything is unjust. But knowing that it's unjust combined with feeling motivated to do something about it or doing something about it tends to be more positive. So this reflection one is kind of funky. It's a little dependent in prior work. And so when we're thinking about what this looks like in the context of system impact, we know based on those demographics that I was talking about right at the beginning, that system impacted youth in confinement are already at a disadvantage for several reasons. Demographically, they're already at a heightened disadvantage in terms of well-being because they're experiencing racialized trauma and poverty and all of these things that are going to be causing significantly worse mental health outcomes, even without contact with the system. And then we know that contact with the system is also bad for young people's well-being and outcomes. And so there's kind of this contradiction where folks who study positive development and well-being among marginalized youth specifically are theorizing, well, in order for them to have any sort of thriving and any sort of positive outcomes, critical consciousness is necessary. Like they've got to understand this system and be able to navigate and recognize the oppression of their world in order to flourish. However, the one study that does look at system impacted youth with these two variables finds that believing that society is fair protects your mental health, looking at that like critical reflection kind of variable. So there's kind of multiple pieces going on at once. So this research seeks to understand how is the meaning making and resistance of oppression via critical consciousness associated with well-being among system impacted youth living in New York City residential facilities. It's part of a much larger clinical randomized control trial. There we go. Co-PIs Dr. Shabnam Javdani and Aaron Godfrey, lots of partners and funders on here that we don't have time to go through one by one. But our final sample is 37 different facilities around New York. And that's where we sampled our young people from. I'm gonna move through these a little quickly just for time's sake, but more juvenile legal facilities than child welfare, slightly heavier boys than girls, although this is like the state's definitions. There are young people of all gender identities all over these facilities. And at the point where we did this analysis, we had 426 youth baseline surveys that we analyzed for this data. About 17 on average, but as young as 12 and as old as 22. More boys than girls, and mostly identifying as straight. And then you'll notice that our race numbers don't add up to 100. That's because we used a race question that allowed them to select all that applied. I do think what's not on here that's important to note is that out of 426 and still out of our final sample, which is just over 500, we had a total of 4 young people who identified only as white. So the entire rest of that sample is identifying as a marginalized racial identity. In terms of measuring well-being, we tried to include a range of outcomes because we know that it's a complicated construct, and this does not capture it entirely, but this is what we went with. Anxiety, depression, somatic complaints, because we know that mental health manifests somatically in marginalized populations, suicidal ideation, hope, and resilience. And all of these were pretty reliable measures. And then for predictors, we had the traditional measures for critical reflection, motivation, and action, which we modified to make sure that they were applicable for the setting. So for example, critical action, the traditional measure includes items like I went to a protest and I wrote a letter to my elected official. Those aren't necessarily things that a young person who's in confinement is able to do. So we did change those items to replace them with things that were within the power of the young people who we were surveying, to make sure that we weren't getting weird data on that front. And then we added sort of a novel scale that basically is critical reflection still, but specific to a system impact context. And so for this scale, we started out with this question. We know there are many reasons young people might get in trouble with the police or courts. Imagine a typical young person gets caught up in the system. How true do you think each of these reasons are for why young people get caught up in the system? And then we offered a whole list of options, some that were very individual based, of like, they just never listen, they're bad kids, and some that were much more structural, like poverty, or they don't have the resources they need, or the system is racist. So for analyses, we ran 5 separate linear regressions, measuring the outcome, measuring the association between the critical consciousness variables and one of the aspects of well-being at a time. We included age, race, gender, sexuality, and a variable for food, financial insecurity, and the type of the facility the participant was in as control variables. And here are some of our results. So for critical motivation, we found that having higher levels of critical motivation was associated with increased levels of hope and resilience among young people. For critical action, we found that having higher levels of critical action was associated with having reduced suicidal ideation among young people. And we found that critical reflection, sorry, my slides do a funny thing right there, but critical reflection didn't have any statistically significant associations on its traditional measure. However, when we measured it using the system-specific version that asked them about their attributions of like why a young person would be impacted by the system, suddenly there were significant associations. So attributing system impact to structural factors was associated with higher depression and anxiety and higher somatic complaints, which is in line with what we've seen before. So for interpreting these results, basically, like I said, very few studies, if any, have kind of explored what these associations look like, specifically in populations that are experiencing marginalization across multiple axes and intersections. And these patterns are going to vary based on the particular component of critical consciousness that we're looking at and the particular component of well-being that we're looking at. And this data demonstrated, again, that that was going to be true. And general understandings of structural inequity may impact well-being differently than recognizing structural roots of specific lived experiences of injustice. So this is sort of one of the important contributions, I think, that, understanding overall that there is injustice in the world is one thing, but understanding the structural injustice that led to you being in the situation that you are in that moment that you're taking the survey is a different, it impacts you differently, is what our data suggests. In terms of these patterns of association, critical reflection, like I said, but only the system-specific critical reflection was associated more with the constructs that were closely associated with diagnostic categories. So it seems like the awareness of these structural inequities that are particular to that youth themselves might worsen mental health symptoms, while critical motivation and a little bit critical action was more associated with the like resilience and hope type of outcome variables. And so we interpreted that as this idea that feeling like you can resist injustice and you're going to resist injustice might be sort of a key mechanism for young people in confinement to feel like they're able to overcome challenges and think about the future and motivate and continue working towards the future while they're being confined. In terms of future directions, these findings, like I've sort of mentioned a few times, mirror the patterns that we see among marginalized youth who aren't system impacted, which is reassuring. So it seems like things are similar, but it is important to keep doing this work in these settings because of the distinct and unique experiences of these young people who are in this like particular nexus of oppression. And then in the future, we want to continue exploring how these associations might differ by additional experiences like gender, sexuality, economic constraints. So we're planning to run some moderations by gender, for example, with the recognition that none of these systems were built for human beings at all. Some of them claim to have been built for boys. None of them really claim to have been built for girls. And definitely none of them claim to have been built for gender expansive youth. And so thinking about that as like an additional layer that they're navigating for the young people holding those identities while they're being confined, and trying to see if that impacts what's going on. This is a very long list of RAs and team members who've supported with this work thus far. And this is a massive thanks to our lovely PIs, Shabnam and Aaron, and an email that you can email that comes to all of the people that could answer your question potentially, but you can also reach out just to me. And I think that is it. I have no idea if I'm anywhere near where I'm supposed to be for time, hopefully. Any questions?
Anyone have any questions? I have a question, but I'm not sure. So my question is, I'm wondering if you saw, I guess, a difference by age or just by participant and like their understanding of like whatever structural inequalities that there were, meaning like I can see a 12-year-old being like something is unfair, but like obviously somebody older might have a different, more in-depth understanding of like, oh, like systematic racism or something like that. And if that might also change the way that, you know, people critically reflect or do other things.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, presuming that it's not significantly impacting anything in the regressions, given that we were controlling for age. But the measures are not particularly like detailed. They're like 6 questions each, I think, for critical reflection, action, and motivation. And they ask things like some youth, I'm going to butcher this off the top of my head, but it's like some youth have access to more educational opportunities than other youth. So they're more broad, which I think can be a strength, but is also a limitation. And I think if you were to use, if someone were to, like with qualitative methods, I bet that age distinctions would pop out more, but I haven't tried just like running the frequencies of that mean, for example, by age. And I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, not that it gets better as you get older, but I'd like to see where that point hits where they're like, oh yeah, this is messed up.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments?
Amira, I have a question. I'm doing my thesis on like hope as a function for resilience in suicidal like ideation to action models. And I was wondering if you could talk about like the critical motivation to critical action pipeline, like via the hope resilience like theme.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, the critical motivation to critical action pipeline. Yeah, I don't think that it's necessarily required for it to be a pipeline. I think they can function distinctly, partially because the critical motivation really requires young people to want to make change and feel like they can make change, whereas the critical action requires them to be doing stuff, but it doesn't require this larger, broader agenda. So like, for example, I think one of the items on our critical action scale is like, I spoke up when I thought somebody's jokes were offensive. And so I don't know if we would always see a pipeline between somebody saying like, oh, I think I have the power to change, to make change in my community, and them interrupting racist jokes. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I don't think I would feel comfortable just asserting that was a pipeline necessarily. But they definitely are connected, and it seems like critical motivation and the efficacy and wanting to make change and feeling able to make change seem to be, based on this research, more powerful in terms of facilitating hope, facilitating resilience, than critical action. And they both push the hope and resilience in the same direction, and also the suicidality, they push it in the same direction. But the motivation feelings and the efficacy feelings seem to have a more significant impact. And I don't know how much of that is because we're in confinement contexts, right? Where young people have a very, very, very limited scope of what they're able to do, and where they may be engaging in action that they are not reporting as action or even conscious necessarily that it's action. So things like that might look like misbehaving or like resisting authority, which are at their core ways of expressing of trying to make change and of standing up to authority in the situation that they're in. I don't know how much of like those sort of micro resistances are getting reported on these critical consciousness scales, so that, you know, the context definitely impacts our ability to kind of make.
Right. To some extent, they have to be aware that they are doing it in order to put it onto the survey.
Yeah. Or they have to think that we think that it's
Yes.
what we're talking about. So.
Right. Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I didn't necessarily have a question, but I found, all of this fascinating as someone who volunteers with youth and is and works with other youth programs, that, it's when I come to these wonderful Psych cafes and you're talking about, the findings that you've have, and it seems as if there's such a disconnect between this research and actual nonprofits or groups that are trying to work with youth, where I feel that they're not looking at or using a lot of them using research and things like that of what works. So we have a lot of organizations that, oh, I want to help children, and I think this is what they should be doing, or I think this is what they need. And then there's a limited outcome, and then kind of wondering, okay, well, why didn't I get what I thought that they just need to play sports and, take them on field trips and things like that without really, and then wondering, okay, well, why are they still in the same situation? So I would love to kind of find, I mean, I know what would be a great idea if you could think of kind of bridging the gap between research and actual organizations that maybe don't know exactly what they want to do, but, oh, I want to help youth.
Yeah. I mean, God bless the implementation scientists, really. Like, I think that is so key. And I think that is really the responsibility of the researchers. Because if you're just publishing facts that are then not actually going anywhere, like, you're really just bolstering your own career and that's it, right? Like, what's the point of that? It's not ethical. So I think there is a responsibility to be both, like, if we find something that we think, nonprofits that are working with young people should know, I feel like there's a responsibility to publish that both in the outlets that we maybe already want to, but also in a way that is easily distributable, and also like there's a responsibility for us to initiate that distribution and not just wait for somebody to in 10 years go find our paper and reference it in a one pager that they're gonna then pass around, and it's gonna be out of date and like maybe interpreted wrong. Like those things I think are a key part of our responsibility. Like I'm almost of the train of thought that like we shouldn't actually be allowed to publish in an academic journal until we've distributed it to the community, but I understand that that is challenging with the peer review process and everything. But yeah, like I think that is really essential.